Welcome to the Really Know Your Customer podcast with your hosts, Betsy Westhafer and Tony Bodo. Join Betsy and Tony as they dive in with highly successful C-suite leaders who have grown successful organizations by creating a laser focus on listening to their customers and building deep customer relationships. Now, it's time to join Betsy and Tony for the Really Know Your Customer show.
Welcome to the Really Know Your Customer podcast. I'm Tony Bodo, CEO of Tony Bodo International.
And I'm Betsy Westhafer, CEO of the Congruity Group.
Betsy, I am excited because Ross is our guest today, and he is an amazing individual. He's got a phenomenal background, which our audience is going to hear. And it just blew my mind when he told us what he did before. But now he's working on what I would call the buyer experience and automating the buyer experience. And it's a part of customer experience that we don't talk about, or most people don't talk about. And it's kind of a new field, actually, I would say. And I love what he dives into, what he goes into, how he talks about the buyer's experience and why it's so important, especially in a B2B environment, and where it's headed. And, kind of touches on that toward the end of the podcast, where the buyer experience is going to become a significant point of differentiation and competition down the road.
Absolutely. Ross Rich is the CEO of Accord, awesome platform for engaging the buyer in the process. But I think what really struck me about this conversation was how much I learned from him in a very short amount of time. And I feel like our audience will feel the same way after they listen to this episode, because he just, he has a very, realistic view, I think, of being a tech entrepreneur and what that means when you're trying to grow a company, but also some really good insights that he's gained through his previous background. So I found this to be just a really enlightening conversation. Again, I know we say this all the time, but we could have talked for 3 more hours on this topic, but also obviously very, very passionate about customers, which is why it's, such a great fit for what we talk about on this show. So without further ado, let's meet Ross Rich. Welcome, Ross. We're so happy to have you here on the show today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Yeah. Thanks for hosting me. Excited to dig into all things customers today.
Yeah, we're excited too. We were just chatting before we logged on about how the three of us are so passionate about all things customer. And so we're super excited to dive into the conversation. Tony, what do you have to say this morning?
I'm looking forward to this because, and I know we're going to dive deeper into this, and I don't want to give too much away, but I'm really excited because someone is finally talking about the customer experience in the sales cycle. And I've been waiting for this episode for a long time.
Yeah, likewise. Okay, so Ross, let's just kick off. Tell us your background, start as far back as you want to, and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, for sure. So I spent, before starting Accord, which I'm sure we'll dive into a bit, the company that I run. Yeah, I spent about 5 years helping scale the sales team at Stripe. So they're a payments technology company. When I joined, it was about 250 people. Now they're about 7,000. So seen some incredible growth. And basically I joined when they were looking for the first salespeople to figure out how to move from self-serve to more of a sales-led motion on top of that. So that was an incredible experience, kind of going through not only figuring out how to sell to different types of customers, but also how to grow a sales organization that is incredibly, as they would say at Stripe, users first. That's one of their key first values. So it's like I learned a lot about focus on customers from there. Before that, totally different world. I was in the music industry at Columbia Records in LA and then New York, managing artists. And, some of the artists that I worked with that you might know, Snoop Dogg, Calvin Harris, Omi, a few others. So that was a different universe than tech sales and payments and APIs and all that good stuff. And now the last couple of years, I've been working with my brother on a company that we co-founded called Accord, which is a customer-facing collaboration platform for B2B sales, onboarding, and success, where basically founders and sales leaders can build a more repeatable, collaborative sales and onboarding process through actually sharing this shared customer workspace with your buyer to align on everything from next steps, milestones, timelines, et cetera, et cetera. So hopefully that's a helpful, quick overview of myself, originally from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I just have to ask, that is we've talked to a lot of CEOs that have transitioned from one career to another. That's a pretty big leap. So how did that happen to go from managing Snoop Dogg to tech sales?
Yeah, I mean, there's not really a great answer to it. It wasn't, I mean, in terms of being super thoughtful, I think my idea after the music industry, one of the reasons why I left was just really the culture. It felt, for being in the creative space, it actually felt very bureaucratic and old school in terms of the structure. It's an old industry, and I think that just kind of comes with it. And I was expecting it to be a lot more creative, new ideas, figuring out new distribution now that there's, digital service providers, all this stuff. And it was just running the same playbook and basically letting these new entrants come in and, take their lunch. And it was really funny because I'd been really interested in not necessarily technology from like a pure technical engineering perspective, but just kind of how the world has been changing so quickly and new companies coming up and innovations. And it felt like wasn't really there at my seat in the music industry. And I ended up following my brother to San Francisco because I was looking for a job in between. I was thinking about actually going to go to law school and being more on, more entrepreneurial and starting my own like music management fund, et cetera, or organization, and kind of thinking about how do we work in this new world in the music industry, and just really fell in love with my idea was like, okay, how do I get, being one of the first salespeople at a technology company where, can kind of see that world a bit and then go to school. And I just somehow got a job at Stripe, this rocket ship company, and instantly fell in love with it. And from there, I was like, okay, there's no chance of going back to school. I'm going to see this through, and really enjoyed my time there, and kind of led me down this path. So it was actually super organic. It wasn't like, I'm going to go into tech after because of this. It just kind of was the super organic path, and got lucky with the company I joined and learned a ton there.
Oh, that's awesome. So tell us more about Accord. I mean, clearly that is your chance to be the creative entrepreneur that you want to be. So tell us what the impetus was, how you landed on this focus for software, and what it does for customers, who your clients are, that kind of thing.
Totally. Well, I think it was funny because when I reflect on it, I think there was two of the most challenging problems that I tried to solve at Stripe that I couldn't really crack led me to starting Accord. And those two pieces were, one, how do you help build a consistent, repeatable kind of sales customer facing motion at a company when it's quickly scaling? And we could never really crack that nut. So basically, as one of the first salespeople, top sales rep there, I was always asked to like help break into, figuring out this new type of product or segment, and kind of, okay, how do you teach the rest of the people now that we're going to have dozens more in that role before you move on? What are all the intricacies and things that you learned from, the dozens or hundreds of deal in that segment or that product that other people can, accelerate their ramp time and learning? And could never really figure out how to do that super effectively. So we'd did a number of different things there, tried to add the exit criteria and more things to Salesforce so they can be better supported along with the process stuff. Wrote up 100 different Google Docs and Sheets and PowerPoints and Confluence pages around, the different stakeholders and questions to ask and all this stuff. Brought in sales trainers and got the classic laminates and all that stuff, and could never really figure out, like, how do you get a sales rep to do something differently before they really learn it and figure out themselves through all those repetitions. And just salespeople don't go back to those resources. That's just not the way that they work. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not the way most people work, right? You're kind of more intuitive. You're trying to like get it done with the stuff that you've already learned before in your past, especially if you're experienced. So that was kind of one part. The next was really the bar for collaboration and transparency and really mutual alignment in sales conversations. I felt like the bar was just incredibly low. Always talk about every training, everything. Don't talk about your product. Don't talk about your needs. Talk about understand the customer and solve their problem together. That's the best way to close more deals, bigger deals, enjoy your job, all those positive things working with your customer. And just felt like people would fall back on, again, just like pitching their thing, pitching to someone versus working with someone. And I found that using collaborative tools like shared Slack channels and creating like mutual plans via Google Docs and Sheets was a really great way of driving this alignment that I was trying to push as a best practice. And after doing customer research, is a best practice for, I think, the top sellers out there. But it's not widely used. It's not used by 9 out of 10 sales reps or customer success reps. So those were kind of the two big things that I wanted to crack with Accord is, how do you build a more consistent, repeatable process that is collaborative? And I think Accord with this shared workspace does both. And you can't really have one without the other. You can't have reps changing their behavior if it's not something they're putting in front of their customer, because that's really the thing that reinforces it. And you can't have the right consistent process that doesn't feel collaborative and mutual. So that's kind of was the impetus, trying to figure out those problems, and really learning from experience, iterating what's the best way to work with customers to get the best outcome. And to me, that was building these, like hacking together these shared workspaces and communication channels so that the dozen of folks on their side and ours could actually work from the same page. You don't have your close plan and Salesforce instance that's all internal, and they don't have their, procurement team and, set of requirements that they're keeping internal and not sharing with you. How do you just put it on the open and say, this is what we got, this is what you need, let's try to figure this out. If not, let's get the no right away. And I think a lot of people are afraid of that way of working, because it's kind of counterintuitive in the world of sales. So hopefully that ramble was helpful background.
Yeah, no, that was great. So do you focus on a particular industry, or how are you going about your sales process?
Yeah, so I don't think it changes much per industry. I think it's the same idea for like how financial advisors work one-on-one with customers, or real estate agents, or large enterprise tech deployments. We're focused on, I'm a huge fan of crossing the chasm, the idea of working with innovators, then early adopters, the early majority, et cetera. And I think that's really what's led us down the path of our first early market, which is the technology world. People that are excited about using technology to solve problems versus people that have the same problem, maybe even more of a problem, but are less so on the technology adoption curve. So we're focused on kind of high growth, VC backed Series A, Series B companies, maybe some earlier stage folks, seed round, or even some later stage companies. Some of our larger partners are on their kind of like late alphabet rounds or public. But yeah, just focused on that are earlier on in their technology adoption curve as a focus.
And do they, for the sales process, it tends to be more B2B, correct? I think that's what you said earlier, just for clarification.
Oh,
right?
Sorry. Yeah. All okay. The business to business side of things, not the consumer end. Yeah.
Well, I heard you say real estate. So I was like, how would that play out in real estate? Because that would be, I'm going through the process of selling right now.
Say you have, I think a great example is I've never purchased a house before. Imagine how great it would be if I was working with 3 potential agents. One of them shares an Accord or shared workspace with me, saying, hey, this is what the process usually looks like. This is how long it takes. This is how we're going to work together. This is my team, blah, 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 who's going to be involved. Oh, you want to loop in your partner and other people. Like, that's how I want to work with anyone. Doesn't have to necessarily be, again, like a large enterprise purchase in the B2B world. I think, again, it's just this best practice in how do you drive consistency in that, help up level folks that might not have learned those best practices before, and really provide a better experience for the buyer.
That's very cool. I'm actually going through the process of selling my house. So I should have jumped on, and we should have had this call, months ago.
Yeah.
No, that's exciting. So I want to dive into something we talked about when we were prepping for this session, and you've just barely touched on it here, but I want to really go deeper. What is it when you look at the sales process, you're really touching on the customer experience and creating this really powerful, positive, transformational experience for people so they can make that decision faster. So take us through why that's so important in the sales process.
Yeah. A million reasons come to my head. I guess I'll start trying to name them. I think one of them is that when we just talked about this is like, buyers don't necessarily know how to buy. It's not a knock on buyers. It's that you live that world of that certain type of transaction, and you innately understand all of the decision-making criteria, the space, the solutions, the market, the process really. And I think there's, we talk a lot about this internally at Accord, like the curse of knowledge. Like, you're assuming that your customer is even close to the realm of understanding to make this decision. And I think really helping people understand how to buy is a really great way of setting the right tone for the relationship. So again, transparently sharing, hey, after doing this hundreds of times over years for your type of business, for this type of transaction, this is what we recommend, and actually giving it to them instead of what happens today. And again, I don't think this is on purpose. This is that curse of knowledge. We assume as a sales organization that people understand this. We say, okay, next thing would be the deep dive. The next thing is this, when you're forgetting, they don't understand the whole process you're bringing them through. It seems like these, they have their blinders on where, okay, we're going to the demo, then we're going to this conversation. How do you first help them understand what journey you're going to even take them on and why, and let them participate in deciding how they're going to do that, I think is really key, because they're going to do it themselves anyway. Why not be a part of that conversation? And again, like, help them through that, because you don't want to go through these next 5 steps just to find out that it's not the right fit for whatever reason, based on, their priorities, what the journey is, et cetera. And I think a lot of people take that for granted. So that is, I think, like a really taking that expectation setting to all the different points of a sales process, I think is really one of the roots of why this is so important.
That seems like such a competitive advantage. If they're talking to several companies,
yes,
and you're already engaging them and educating them and showing how focused you are on making this go well for them, that just seems like a no-brainer to me.
That's who I want to work with.
Incredible competitive advantage.
Yeah.
Well, it seems like it's lowers the risk of doing business with you if you're using a cord. And
yes.
I'm going back to one of our previous episodes. Mark Smith, he's a master in sales, and he talks about, the whole thing you have to focus on is lowering risk. And what is more risky than being in the sales process and not knowing what that journey is? Or I've never even had anyone ever say what you just said here, which is buyers don't know how to buy. I mean, that to me is such a profound statement that we just overlook. And I'm thinking about my own business here, like, wow, I've never really thought about it that way before.
I wrote that down as well.
And it's an insight that I think, as with most great business insights, comes from your customers saying it over and over in different ways. And I think that's been one of the keys, is like hearing from different sellers and sales organizations. They're so frustrated by their buyer. And again, it's this, we don't understand that they don't have the knowledge that we have, and we assume because it's so basic to us in our industry and doing this thing so many times, we forget where they're coming from. So that's, it's been really, really interesting and maybe helpful. And maybe I got this insight because I was like kind of dropped into the world of sales and technology from a different background. So I can maybe see it in that lens of like what it looks like from someone else, instead of living it. And then it's like, okay, how do you not know this? Yeah.
What comes to mind for me, Tony and I wrote a book back in 2018. And one of the things we talked about is, what these things mean for an individual. And so you think about somebody that's in sales, how much is riding on them doing it right and purchasing the right things and just, the up the chain, how it's viewed on how they do things. It seems to me like it's almost like an insurance policy for that person that you're having a communication with, that they're bringing other people in, they're collaborating with you, and like, how much better does it get through the process? And then you can share all that with your senior leadership team and say, here's how we did this. Seems like a big personal career advancement type opportunity as well.
Totally. I think you bring up the other dimension that I feel like is talked about, but not like fully understood, is that internal buying, like the social dynamics of that internal buying group, right? So like most times someone with a problem is the one looking for the solution, who isn't necessarily the big decision maker. Even if they are, you need sign off from a number of people, especially now, especially technology decisions, or really any decision. Folks are much more collaborative internally. It's not these silos. So every decision affects other groups of people. And I think people, again, this curse of knowledge, like sellers don't deeply understand or empathize with the job of the buyer. They have a job on top of the thing that they're doing. This is your full-time job, selling the thing. It is not their full-time job to buy anything. It's like a tool for them to solve their problems. And I think people discount when people get, the ghosting of salespeople or like unresponsiveness or pace isn't usually due to, my personal opinion is that it isn't due to anything necessarily that like you're doing. It's the stuff on their end that they need to do. And if you don't understand what their process is, if you're not sharing yours and understanding what their process is internally, there's no way you're going to be able to accelerate that. And that is typically the best way to accelerate a sales process, is actually helping your buyer buy, again, like that whole idea, and understanding what do they need to present. Like Betsy, you said, like, all the stuff that they need to do. And a tool like a cord really helps you give them the stuff that they're going to have to do on their end and somehow find this extra hour or two to put together to present to their team. So hopefully it's like, oh, you've done their job for them. And that's what we hear a lot of the time is like, it's so hard herding all the cats internally. That's why most of these projects don't get done. It's not necessarily, the number of features you have or the price or whatever. It's like, who has the time? And they get stuck in these little tasks that you can hopefully unlock from your customer if you understand what they're actually doing on their end.
Like Tony said, I wish we'd had this call a while back. I am currently working with a prospect, and she needed help selling customer advisory board up to the chain and getting the budget approval. And so I think this whole process would have been a lot easier with something like Accord, but I was really trying to help her build her case. We iterated multiple times on a deck, and, her leadership team came back and said, here's some other information I'd like to have. And we put together a RACI matrix and all of those kinds of things that if I could have laid that out for her and said, here's a path to help you achieve your goal of getting this approved in the budget, and here's how we're going to go about it, because I had this knowledge of best practices, I can see where that would have been very peace inducing for her, because the whole time she's like, I don't know. And she was new to the company and blah, blah, blah. And so anyway, I think that's from somebody that's, also in sales, I can see what an advantage that would be to get just that relationship built, with that prospect.
Totally. Yeah. The idea is to try to shift the whole, the way that you're building this partnership. And that's why our whole brand is about, from vendorship to partnership. How do you change the conversation and framing of everything from we're selling you this thing to we're trying to do this together? And I think some people it's funny because I think we get a very divisive reaction to that. Some people are like, this is exactly how I want to work with my partners and how I want to sell, et cetera. And some people are like, don't pretend like it's a partnership. You're just trying to sell me this thing. And I think it's so ingrained, unfortunately, in the industry when people hear of sales and people hear of this stuff, because that's the way it's been done for so long. That even when you say you don't want to do it that way, people are like, we don't even believe you. That's not how it's done. Yeah.
When we were doing our prep session, we were talking a little bit about, while you're in the B2B space, there's also this kind of B2B2C concept, right? So your clients might be B2C companies.
Yeah.
And how do you use your tools and really help your team, if you will, understand the needs of your customers, or how do you help your clients understand the needs of their customers if they're a B2B2C company?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that is an interesting dynamic of Accord in terms of customers, because we serve and we sell to sales teams, sales organizations, founders, et cetera, of these B2B organizations, but their customers who they're selling to and sending these over to could look very different. We have people that sell exclusively to Fortune 50 companies, and we have folks that do, dozens of onboardings a week and use Accord. So one of the ways that we help is we try to, because we're working with all these different types of companies, and everyone on our team has a pretty deep background in B2B sales and onboarding, is try to come up with these playbooks where at least it's a starting point for them. And it's like, okay, if you sell to this type of company or this is your type of process, here's something to start. Because people have, I think, trouble putting pen to paper in that first draft, right? And even if it's not even close, having that 20-30% start, and you can start to think about, oh, what does it look like for my customers, I think is super helpful. And people, I'm sure, in your line of work, you see this as well. People have trouble just getting started with it. They know it's a problem. So I think that's one of the ways, and we should be doing much, much more for that. And we're even thinking about ways of having it live outside the product. So even earlier on in people's buying experience for Accord, they can start to understand and think about, we can add value, and they think about what their process is like for their customers. So I think those playbooks, and again, just that starting point, hopefully is super, super helpful for our customers. But another thing is that even within a similar industry, a different size company or different persona you're selling to, the process is going to look super different, the way you're going to frame it. So it's hard to both have that prescriptive best practice as well as the flexibility to change based on, again, same industry, same type of product, different persona you're selling to. You're going to want to frame it and walk them through the process super different. So trying to walk that line of hey, here are best practices, but we want to work with you to figure out and better understand who you're selling to and how to kind of frame it. But yeah, it's a tricky problem when we want to build something very flexible and large and scalable. But you also know you need to start being very specific. That's been one of the most interesting, I think, business lessons for me that kind of ties into customers is you want to solve something for everyone, but the only way to do that is to first focus on very specific problems and helping a very small subset of customers do that, which is just, again, like not, I feel like how the human brain works. You think like be big, solve everything versus like very narrow and kind of grow from there.
So Ross, tell us a little bit about, as the leader of your organization, you're also responsible for the culture of your company. What is your philosophy on how you get your team aligned culturally with how you deal with your customers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it starts really much from a hiring perspective. The first people you're going to bring onto your team, like, I think that's something that I've learned. A big learning for me is I've always thought, you train people and teach them the way. I think a lot of people come in and it's going to be even hard to change the way people look at it. So you need to, I think, bring in first people that have the same philosophy around working with customers. Not even the strongest culture, I think, can really change that. And then, I don't know, still figuring it out, to be totally honest. I think it's a tough balance because you want to give people the space to make decisions, to make mistakes, to own their work. But you also want to set the bar in a certain way and have those adjustments. So I think it's a mix of both sharing like, hey, this is our philosophy, but also coming in on very specific things as examples and almost not being the micromanager, every second of every day, but coming in and be like, this is what I mean by that. The wording, we're saying like this needs to be we, or this needs to be something very specific. So it's this interesting balance. I was just reading very random Winston Churchill's biography, and he was, I think, a great example of both like setting the philosophy for Britain and the UK, and would come in on these it was like hilariously random things, like related to like street signs on the road, and would write this like detailed letter about it. I think that's a great example of like, okay, you just set the tone, but then you need to give people like incredibly specific examples of it. And hopefully the combination of those two work. Before I thought, without, I still don't have a ton of leadership management experience, but I thought it was all about like, setting the tone, setting the culture, like these are our themes. And I don't think that works without showing your deep understanding about how you actually want to see things work. So it's this like really tough balancing act, I think, between the two.
It's so funny, the example you gave about saying we instead of I. It's such a nuanced thing, and it's such an important thing. And honestly, I remember exactly where I was when my boss 30 years ago told me that, and it just made such an impact. We were on a plane returning from a meeting, and apparently I needed that lesson. And it sticks in my brain, and so those things are really important. And I think going back to your point about how sometimes we make assumptions that the people we're trying to work with understand the buying process, making the assumption internally that your team knows what you mean when you talk about how you want to do things. I think that's a really important point about the leader providing that clarity on, do it in your own style, but here's what we're looking for, as an outcome. I think that's really good insight.
Ross, I'm sitting here and thinking about the category that you're in, which is frankly a new category, right? It didn't exist before. And then I'm thinking about all these different, technology products that are out there or will be coming to the market in the next 3 to 5 years. We know there's going to be a lot of change. We don't know what that's going to be yet. What kind of advice would you give to, let's say, another entrepreneur that's coming into creating a category, basically, or jumping into a very new category, around how should they get to know who their customer is so that they're more successful right off the bat, so they don't have this lag time in getting that category up and running?
Yeah, I think it's a very different playbook when you're trying to do something more, for lack of a better word, like net new, versus a much better solution for a problem that there's a solution for that's been solved. So for example, at Stripe, online payments, mobile payments has forever been a thing. It's been awful, both for the end customer trying to check out, as well as for the developers or team that need to integrate it. But that thing looked very similar. Again, not exactly the solution, how you'd implement it from the end customer developers, but like there was a way to process, and it was awful. Whereas with Accord, I think it's a bit different because there aren't already tools for this customer collaboration, shared workspace, and driving consistency in the sales process. Again, it's like laminates and Salesforce stages and like internal documentation, which is very different than something like this. So I think you really need to understand and the approach to building something that's new. And it's a lot about education. It's a lot about tying into what I think we've kind of like organically come to, which is like these concepts that people share, like this, again, this idea of like from vendorship to partnership. That is a great way to summarize what we're trying to do, and is not necessarily the solution, because people, you're not gonna be able to say, oh yeah, we have collaborative workspaces for buyers and sellers. Like that means nothing to anyone because it's not a solution. You say online payment checkout, that's already a thing, and you do it 100 times better. People know those problems and you solve for them. So I think tying into, and it's funny that this is all kind of like, it's consistent with what we're saying about like this curse of knowledge, and people don't understand, like you're going to assume because you live this thing that everyone sees it the way that you do. And oh, the cloud workspace, that solves this problem and everyone gets it. No, like people aren't in that world yet. They're not thinking about it that way. How do you tie to something that a layman, someone that hasn't thought about it a lot, understands and grasps that concept? So I think that's been a really big learning that I'd recommend for people trying to do something very new. How do you tie it back to something that people already get, instead of really focusing on like the exciting new thing that you do? Very similar to sales. No one's going to be excited about your features or functionality. They're going to be excited about the problem you solve. So how do you kind of back out of that, which I think, again, is totally different than how you'd market and get off the ground with a much better way of doing something else that exists today.
I would think too that marketing would be a real key to this in terms of what are those search terms that a prospect would be searching on to ultimately find you, with this being a new thing. And then what's that messaging for you? How do you speak about it? I'm sure you've had a lot of marketing discussions about this.
It's very tricky because usually you're taking away market share and mind share from like existing things. So again, solutions, not just purely the problem side. And for some things you need to be probably more aggressive on and build yourself. Some things you probably need to be more patient with, because you can't really ever change the market. You can change people's perception in the market, but you're never really creating a market. You're kind of like, again, I think maybe to put in like the category creation term, like you're kind of creating a category within an existing market. But that's another big learning that I've had, is the power of the market is just like, it's like the ocean. You're not going to be able to like change that. You're going to have to figure out how to play in it and position yourself. And I think from the outside, it always seemed like maybe something like you can do a lot to change. You're never going to change what's actually happening in the market. You need to be super aware of that like macro world that you're playing in and figuring out how you're going to fit in there. And I don't think that's something that a lot of people talk about. Everyone wants to be like, oh, I created this thing. I like built this market. Like markets aren't built. You figure out how to play within them, I think.
And want to embroider on this because we just did another interview, and the topic of humility came up. And it's funny because it was very much along the same lines that you're just describing here. Is like, you've got to have humility from a perspective of, I'm not going to create the market. I have to position myself in that place. I'm a small piece of a big thing. Right. And it's having the confidence that, hey, we can do this. We've got a good solution for a problem that needs to be solved, but we're not going to create a whole new space. Right. And it's fascinating to me because when you see a company that had, and I'm not saying Stripe does this, so audience, don't take this that way. I'm just using them as an example. Stripe is huge. Like if you're in online business right now, you know what Stripe is. If you're a consumer, you probably have an idea of what Stripe is, right? And yet Stripe isn't, Stripe could be saying, look how big we made this. But that's not how they started. They were just a small piece of a very big market that they had to go after. And so I think I'm a historian. I love that you were reading Winston Churchill's biography, because, it's like we look back and we can tell history however we want to tell history. But when you talk to people in the moment, it never looks the way the history books, describe it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. The humility is super important and gives you a different perspective on, how to work with customers, but also like how to position yourself for customers in the market, and like, how are people going to see us, not how we're going to make them see us. Because again, like that's just something I'm finding more and more that you can't change. And I think again, early on, you're going to have a lot of assumptions. And like, I think we as a team came into the market with very deep expertise in sales and in this type of stuff, and lived it and like hacked together stuff for years and figured it out and worked on the problem, which is not, I don't think, very common for technology solutions, at least in the early days, and still didn't have near the depth of understanding of the market before we brought a product into it and had 1,000 sales conversations and 1,000,000 no's and people actually using it and testing it and hearing what they say. It's inevitably going to be different. There's no way you're going to nail it. And being open to those changes, I think, is one of the reasons why we've kind of seen some of the success we've had today. And if we just kept our heads down and said we were right from day one with 1,000,000 assumptions that we made, and even being aware that those are assumptions, I think that's another area that people think is like, you hear about these famous entrepreneurs, Steve Jobs, blah, blah, blah. Like, yes, they had really strong ideas and bets, but I think all of them did a really good job of listening to the market and adjusting and being open to those data points, which is something that's not, as sexy and people don't talk about as much. It's great to have this super, super smart person that saw the future, but part of seeing the future is taking all the data points in and what's happening now and judging based on that.
When you were talking about the humility in this interview that Tony and I just did yesterday, I pulled out this quote. Well, Tony and I both hung on to this one thing he said, and I posted on LinkedIn yesterday, was the customer is already on a journey. You just want to deserve to be a part of it. And so I thought that was just so powerful. And in thinking about, you're not, back to what you said, you're not going to change the market, but the goal is to deserve to be a part of it. So I just thought that was really an interesting take on humility.
I love that. I think I need to take that back to our team. I think, again, talking about category creation is, if you're going to waste a lot of time and calories thinking about really generating demand, it's funny, it's like a marketing term. What you really are trying to do is finding people in that journey to consider you, right? You're never trying to like, hey, I didn't realize I had this problem at all, and I'm not looking for a solution to it. I'm not willing to invest it. Now I'm going to. That is going to be a high cost of acquisition, a very hard slog for you as a company. Maybe you are amazing marketers and salespeople and you can do that. That's not the business I want to be in. I want to be in the business where a lot of people are trying to solve this problem. They have an idea generally of the right way of solving it. Maybe it's through working, more collaboratively and building repeatable processes. And, I'm inserting myself into you thinking about this already. Who are the people? When are they thinking about this? What are the types of companies? How do we put ourselves in there and kind of build from there? Then I'm going to suddenly change everyone's minds about this. Like, that is going to be an incredibly hard, inefficient task and way of building a business. Then, like you said, inserting yourself into finding where they hang out and when they're thinking about that kind of decision. So it's really good.
It's like swimming upstream otherwise. Yeah.
Exactly.
Russ, unfortunately, this time is just flying by. One last thing we wanted to run by you is, on our show, we like to give a shout out to a nonprofit or a charitable organization or just a group that you think is doing really great work. And then we highlight that in our show notes. And so we want to give you the opportunity to just let us know about an organization that you have a particular affinity for.
That is a great question. I think an organization that I worked with when I was out in San Francisco for a number of years, Street Soccer USA, is a great one. Coaching kids soccer and kind of through the values of that, kind of helping them kind of guidance and teaching some lessons. So yeah, that's a shout out Street Soccer USA.
Awesome. Thank you. Tony, what final questions or comments do you have for Russ?
Oh, putting me on the spot here. This is, I could go down, ask another 10 questions here. I think the biggest thing for me is, what do you see happening? Like, if you were to look, say 3 to 5 years from now, where do you see the market moving to because of what you guys are doing at Accord? Obviously competitors are going to come in, things are going to happen. Kind of what's your, if you had a crystal ball, what would that kind of look like to you?
Like how the market plays out?
How the market plays out, how this whole idea of the buyer experience, how is that going to play out over the next 3 to 5 years in your mind?
Yeah, I think one of the macro trends that we're seeing drive a lot of this is the B2C experience and the new expectations that, like, people think in business, like businesses are buying, people are buying. And in day-to-day life, you've seen with the last 5 to 10 years, the instant now transparent process with Amazon or Uber or Airbnb or all these things, you just get so much more detail than just phoning someone up. You have a million more options. I think you're going to see that play out in the B2B world. So you're going to see a million more options for the same type of solutions as technology, kind of becomes ubiquitous. It's going to be much, much more competitive even than what it is today. And people think it's wildly competitive on the marketing and sales side today. I think it's not even going to be close in a few years. And one of the ways you're going to be able to differentiate is going to be your brand. Again, similar to the B2C world, people spend much, much more money and buy and become fans of the brand. I think you're already seeing that with certain companies. I think that's going to be the way of the future. And things like Accord or other much more transparent, collaborative brand building tools are going to be needed to stand out and be successful. So I think that's kind of the really big trend there is it's going to be a buyer's world before it was a seller's world, before there's like one or two or three solutions in the market and it's very clear how they differentiate from each other. It's going to be ubiquitous for a lot of these different types of solutions, much more VC funding, many more startups, many more engineers, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, you're going to really have to separate yourself out from that buyer first experience in their brand. So I think you're already seeing a lot of this stuff play out with like the rise of content and communities, all this other stuff. I think that's just going to accelerate in the next few years.
Ross, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we will definitely be watching Accord. Excited to see the success that I'm sure Tony and I agree it's out there for you. It's yours for the taking, because I think this is just so key to how business will be done moving forward. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we will be talking to you again soon.
Sounds great. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Betsy, my favorite line in this whole episode is buyers don't know how to buy. I mean, I have never thought about it from that perspective before. And literally, it's an epiphany that's still blowing my mind. Buyers don't know how to buy.
Yeah. And, it comes back to what we talked about in this episode, which was making assumptions. We all make assumptions that our buyers know exactly what the process is and how they are going to move things forward. And a lot of times they just don't. And so the lesson one is, don't make assumptions. And two, the more you can partner with them, I like his tagline about from vendorship to partnership. The more you can partner with them to help them through this buying process, then that in itself becomes a competitive advantage because they see that you're a valuable partner already just in the process of selling. I also thought it was really interesting that he said, some people think it's just total BS that they want to be partners because they're like, no, you just want to sell me something, and how they fight against that mentality. But also, the right one, not everybody's your right customer, right? So the right ones will not think that. They'll say, oh, no, he's making a concerted effort to partner with me to help me figure this out and get through this buying process. So I just think there was a lot of humanness to this conversation, and the how to interact at a human level as well as at a business level.
Yeah, I really love that he talked about the aspect, which we've talked about this, since we wrote our book back in 2018, that it's not businesses that are buying, it's people that are buying. And I think if we keep that front and center, we can successfully navigate the process and build relationships, person to person, which allow us to do business then. Exactly.
And I think even when we know that, it's always good to be reminded that it's not, you're not selling to a business, you're selling to a person. So Tony, as always, a pleasure to do these interviews with you. Appreciate it. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. If you have not yet subscribed to our podcast, please do hit the notification button so you can know when new episodes are coming out. We're coming out with them pretty fast and furious now, so we'd love to let you know when they get released. And in the meantime, we will see you on the next episode of Really Know Your Customer podcast.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Really Know Your Customer. We hope you gained a lot of value from being here today. If you want to learn more about the work Betsy and Tony do to help their clients thrive, Visit Betsy at thecongruitygroup.com and Tony at tonybodo.com. See you next time on the Really Know Your Customer Show.